everyone. Thank you for attending day 2 of the DC CTSA Spring Regulatory Update and Hot Topics in Clinical and Translational Research. As Jane mentioned, I am Hiromi Sanders from the Office of the Vice President for Research at the George Washington University. We're going to start our first panel entitled Challenges for Researchers During the Pandemic. And I am excited and honored to introduce a wonderful lineup of speakers who will provide insight into the many challenges faced by researchers in their research projects during the COVID pandemic. We have an excellent panel of clinical researchers who will discuss their projects, the specific challenges they and the research team experience, and we'll discuss project goal reconfigurations that occurred due to the pandemic. As mentioned by our welcome address by Dr. Vibalis, we hope this panel will, and this conference will shed light and perhaps allow for a blueprint on how to navigate research and research issues during these types of global events. And so now I will introduce each of our panelists and provide a bio. Okay. First, we have Federico Asch, Dr. Federico Asch, Director, Cardiovascular Core Labs, Director, Cardiac Imaging Research at MedStar Health Research Institute at Washington Hospital and Center. Dr. Asch has been involved in cardiovascular research for over a decade with expertise in cardiac imaging in the context of clinical trials. His interests are in supporting clinical studies that aim to understand the effect of new and emerging treatments, especially devices, drugs, and biologic agents that are being developed for treatment of heart disease, malignancies, and others. Dr. Asch has had a long-standing interest in diseases of the aortic valve and the aorta, including genetic disorders that affect connective tissues with resulting vascular abnormalities. Second up, we've got Dr. Sharon Dowell, Associate Professor of Medicine, Department of Internal Medicine, Division of Rheumatology at Howard University Hospital. Dr. Dowell received her medical degree from the University of the West Indies and completed her residency in internal medicine at the University of Connecticut, where she received both Intern and Chief Resident of the Year award. She received her rheumatology fellowship training at the University of Maryland. Dr. Dowell is the course director for the Introduction to Clinical Medicine in the Howard University Hospital College of Medicine and is an active participant in both departmental and divisional activities, as well as in regional chapters of national organizations. Dr. Dowell serves as the Vice President of the Caribbean Association for Rheumatology and chairs the Georgetown Howard University Center for Clinical and Translational Science, IRB, Institutional Review Board. She provides expertise in general rheumatology with special interest in patient education and circumventing barriers to care. Dr. Dowell spearheads a research project evaluating the impact of patient education on various disease states and overall disease outcomes. And then we have Dr. Jill Smith, who is a clinician scientist and professor of medicine at Georgetown University and the Lombardi Comprehensive Cancer Center. Dr. Smith practices GI hepatology at the Washington, D.C. Veterans Affairs Medical Center. As a clinical scientist, Dr. Smith's passion has been bench-to-bedside translational research. She has a basic science lab and is conducting clinical trials in liver and pancreatic diseases. And so we're excited to have our panelists and attendees and hope to engage in a robust dialogue during the Q&A portion. Attendees, please be sure to submit your questions for the panelists throughout their presentations using the Q&A function. Dr. Asch, please turn on your video when you are ready, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiromi. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel and hopefully to share some of the experiences over the last year that certainly have been challenging for all of us, and I am not exception there. But one way or the other, we made our work move forward, and that's really what I want to share with you. So if we go to my first slide, I will start by sharing with you a little bit what my activities are. As it was mentioned in my introduction, I direct a core laboratory. What the core laboratory is basically a lab that provides services for multicenter clinical trials to provide an independent central analysis of data. In my case, data is cardiovascular imaging. That's what my expertise is about. particularly echocardiography, but not only. I also do CT and cardiac MRI. Now, my laboratory is actually a large operations, if you want. It's an academic lab, but really performs as a service, if you want. But being myself an academician, I partner with sponsors, and I do participate in all different activities within the clinical trials, from being on steering committees, publications committee, data analysis publications, and so on. My team is composed of 20 to 25 individuals that include anywhere from administrative people, IT people, sonographers, technicians, managers, and coordinators, research coordinators. And of course, some physicians, including myself. We have 4 physicians that are ultimately responsible for the operations in my lab. The services we provide are basically around what our sponsors need for specific projects, whether they are industry sponsors or the federal government or foundations of different kinds, including professional societies. Our role is mostly about using imaging for describing efficacy and safety of different interventions. Those interventions could be cardiovascular devices such as prosthetic valves, TAVRs, mitral devices or mitral valve devices, drugs of different kinds, whether it's about safety of cardio-oncological nature for oncological treatments, or the use of stem cells and the impact on myocardial function, and so. Most of our sponsors or of our studies are actually sponsored by industry. However, we do have some federal NIH mostly sponsored trials, and we have some that are sponsored by foundations. So really my role on all of this is to be the principal investigator for the imaging component, and in some of these studies to be the overall principal investigator. In addition to the operations of the core services, I do participate in multiple investigator-initiated studies. Those are both investigator-initiated through federal funding or through other sources of funding that are international studies. But as well, I do some investigator-initiated projects mentoring fellows from the cardiovascular disease program here at MedStar, Washington Hospital Center, and Georgetown University program. The nature of these works, of these investigator-initiated, are diverse, but really the scope of my interest is mostly on valvular heart disease nowadays. So whether we're talking about investigator-initiated or the core services, really valvular heart disease is nowadays, or what we call the structural heart disease, are really where most of my work is happening nowadays. If we can go to the next slide. Now that you understand roughly what my job is on a day-to-day basis, you will start understanding what the specific challenges during the pandemic were. Number one, I lead a large team of people internally within MedStar and Georgetown University group. Within that group, there has been a lot of disruption of the dynamics, if you want, of the work. I mean, we are a very close, tight team. We are all full-time employees of the same place. We have a large facility within the hospital, the Washington Hospital Center campus. And over the years, more than 25 years of existence of our lab, really the day-to-day collaboration among all of us has been the fundamentals of our engine for performing our job. So clearly, the moment the pandemic started kicking in, that was going to be a big challenge. We were not going to be able to see each other. walk to each other's desk and office, to discuss teams, to do all the quality control activities that we do, and to have a lot of team meetings that we have over the week. But in addition to that, we knew that with the whole concept of quarantine and isolation, a lot of issues would come up with well-being. Each of the team members, of course, would be reacting to the reality of the pandemic in different ways, and one way or the other, we wanted to be there for our associates to be able to carry on with their lives and ultimately to be able to perform as good as they have been doing for so many years. So those were probably the biggest concerns from a team perspective. Now, as you can imagine, as a core service, we actually interact with a multitude of teams outside of MedStar, outside of our laboratory. And the interaction with the study teams for each of these sponsors and each of these clinical trials was going to be key. Clearly a challenge, considering that we have over 50 or 55 active clinical trials we're working on. So really the dynamics of juggling all these different balls and being able to still perform for each of these trials and each of the over 15, 20 sponsors that we have was going to be something we had to focus on. After discussing the idea of how the challenges were perceived to happen for our team, you need to understand that while we don't enroll our own patients for our core services, we do depend on enrollment of patients worldwide, because all these clinical trials are multi-center, international, and we receive images from anywhere, from New Zealand, Australia, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and obviously Europe and the United States in multiple different ways. Now, from receiving those images, which in some cases happened through FedEx and UPS, and we didn't know how exactly that was going to be disrupted and how the different needs during the pandemic could affect our operations in that matter. Over the last few years, fortunately, we have been mostly working through web-based transfer of images, reports, and everything that we do. Clearly, during the pandemic, the web transfer of images and data was going to be the way to go for us. On the other side, if you want, of this interaction with our sponsors was actually what was going to happen with all these patients worldwide, right? Because over the initial months of the pandemic, obviously, patients were not coming for any kind of research activities that would be happening. So enrollment of patients and follow-up of patients were not going to happen, or were going to happen in different ways. Each of the clinical centers had different ways of pursuing their operations, but I can tell you that we saw anywhere from centers that basically would not enroll any patient to centers that would still enroll and do many of these procedures on the basis of the urgency for example, aortic stenosis or significant mitral regurgitation, so they could still be able to enroll patients. But the follow-up was a different thing, because if you think about it, there's nothing urgent about following up on patients that already had their procedures or their treatments done in the past. But for example, a patient with aortic stenosis who had a valve replacement 2 years ago and still needs to undergo all the follow-up for clinical trials, including having an echocardiogram done, those patients still, from a research perspective, need to be followed up. We still need to show whether those valves are functioning properly, whether any adverse events are happening on these patients for malfunction of these devices that were implanted. Now, patients didn't want to come to the hospitals. That didn't happen here in the US, in DC. or that didn't happen anywhere in the world. Of course, during the pandemic, everyone wanted and had to be at home, so follow-up was a very significant challenge for all these patients. There were some companies that actually were striving during the pandemic because they were offering services to go out to patients' homes or nursing homes or wherever patients would be and do there the follow-up, the clinical follow-up, data collection, the clinical examinations, or even the echocardiograms. And those companies would actually be hired by the sponsors to be able to continue follow-up as much as possible. As some patients started slowly coming back in the hospital, still there was an issue about how thorough that follow-up had to be. So there was a lot of amendments on clinical trials for any kind of follow-up to be simplified, to be kept for a minimum. So for example, an echocardiogram that normally would be, let's say, 65 to 70 images would be trimmed to the very basic 20-25 images, so an echocardiogram could be performed in, let's say, 10 minutes rather than half an hour. So a lot of different adjustments were made at the sites and even at the patient's home to be able to continue the relevant pieces of the follow-up in this matter. So all these different pieces turned into us still receiving echocardiograms, still receiving some studies, but obviously at a much lower pace. So this description really takes into account all the challenges related to patient enrollment, but also the challenges that our sponsors were going through to be able to accommodate their dynamics to still fulfill the needs on safety and efficacy evaluation for their studies. If we go to the next slide, how were we as a team, as a research team, be able to continue working? Well, I have to say that as soon as the pandemic was starting, actually, it was still not a pandemic, it was called different ways. When it started in China, end of December or so, I already realized that because of the international nature of our operations, this was going to have a big impact on us. And if sooner or later it would come to our country, then it would need for us to split our usual dynamics. So I started preparing early January in a way of having our operations completely virtual. So everyone would have access to their computers. We have 2 or 3 different ways of accessing our computers in the laboratory. Those that needed to upgrade their computers or their monitors or anything like that, we provided that for them. And we made sure, and we made several testing during January of how it would work for anyone if from one day to the other we had to change our operations, so everyone would have to work from home. So at no surprise, as we were very ready and we were tested, early first week in March, we decided to go completely virtual. Initially, we thought this was going to be for a couple of months, as it happened to everybody else. But honestly, until a few weeks ago, we were all operating completely virtual. We were having Teams meetings all the time through the web. We were having Zoom calls here and there. But everyone was able to access their computer, and they had the capacity to access more than one computer in case the first one wouldn't work. So everyone really had a good chance to work from home so they could adapt to the needs that each of us would have. Of course, new opportunities came with this. A lot of people actually are not really looking forward now to come back, but we are very slowly starting to come back in our operations here in the lab. But not everyone can do it, so we are flexible in that matter. The old projects, it was much easier because actually as I was preparing for 2 months for the pandemic, I actually started holding up on some of this data analysis. So I started spreading this data from December all the way into March. So the initial months when we were not receiving much data from the clinical centers, we had the opportunity to catch up with all work that was left behind from December to March. So we really never slowed down. We were a little bit slower, but not significantly. We continued being operational, and that was of very, very good use for the research institute as a whole, because as other pieces of the research institute were really suffering from patient enrollment locally, we were still financially being able to support the rest of the operations from the research institute. New opportunities came as we started having a little bit more free time, which was not really free. I started myself building more on the investigator-initiated component. So I actually started putting together some COVID-related projects. I started collaborating with multiple institutions nationally. We got a grant from the American Heart Association to be able to do some work on COVID patients related to ECHO and providing core services. And I launched myself an international study to understand how COVID was affecting the hearts of people in multiple countries around the world. And in addition to that, I started pairing with technological companies that provide or started developing artificial intelligence algorithms that would help us analyze echocardiograms, the images, and analyze the data coming out of these echocardiograms. So we've been actually doing some groundbreaking work related to our machine learning and artificial intelligence in the field of echocardiography that are now starting to get published. And so there has been a lot of really good stuff going, really good new opportunities that we have been taking advantage of. If we can go to my last slide so I can try to wrap up my experiences here. What are the lessons that we learned? Well, first of all, we were doing a continuous risk assessment evaluation, and that allowed us to be prepared in advance and to implement our plans very early during the time of the pandemic. I have to say that this is something we actually learned a few years ago when we had a major IT problem with ransomware and so in our organization. And we learned a lot of lessons of how we had to keep ourselves safe, how we would be able to still work with our data even under very challenging situations, technological challenging situations. So from there, we learned a lot of things. Clearly, we could adapt some of those learning into the pandemic scenario. And I would think that the learnings from the pandemic and the learnings from our previous experience with the IT challenges are making our organization so much stronger in preparing for significant challenges and adverse situations that really one cannot foresee. I mean, no one saw this pandemic going or coming. No one saw this pandemic affecting us so much, but it did happen. So preparing in advance, doing continuous risk assessments, that is really the way to go. And once you are immersed in this challenging situation, identify unique opportunities and shift your goals and shift your plans as you can to not only take care of the business that you have to take care of. And when I say business from a research perspective, but also to start developing new ones and be able to develop and execute on them to really succeed during the pandemic. I am going to close now, but I want to close with a very positive message. As negative as the pandemic has been, I think our laboratory and our institution have been able to stay afloat. And not only that, we actually were able to strive in multiple new areas that we were not developing in the past. With that, I want to close, and obviously I will wait for any questions that will be coming in our questions and answers section.
Hi, good morning, everyone. That was great, Federico. And I'm going to come with a slightly different perspective. But first, I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to participate in this discussion, which is so relevant to all of us. Next. So, the first task was to describe our current research, and I want to give a bit of a background of what we do. So we conduct clinical research in rheumatology. And by that, I mean we participate significantly in clinical trials for new medications, which is a rapidly evolving area in rheumatology right now. And we believe that this will afford our patients the opportunity to participate in research. It will lead to more diverse population when it comes to research. And there's also potential access to new drugs for patients who are underinsured and the opportunity to be part of finding a better treatment for these conditions. But besides clinical research, and you can go to the next, sorry. Besides clinical research, our research focuses on ways to improve access to care and to improve patients' compliance and self-efficacy, and ultimately to improve outcomes in rheumatic diseases. Next. All of these are actually offered in a continuum of patient care. And for instance, we have the Howard University Rheumatoid Arthritis Early Diagnosis Clinic, next, which is a way for us to get patients who have rheumatoid arthritis into our clinics early, because we recognized in our clinic population that RA patients were being seen 3 or 4 months or even longer after they had first onset of symptoms. So this particular study was a web app that was created and given to primary care physicians, where they would enter information into this web app, and if patients met a critical score, they would have an early appointment into the Howard University RA clinic. And by doing that, we wanted to see whether patients who were referred through this web app, whether they had better disease outcomes than those who were referred to the regular conventional method. We also hope that by doing this, that we could also inform primary care doctors on how to recognize rheumatoid arthritis and hence get patients in even earlier. And so one secondary objective for this particular study was to look to see whether over time, what was the accuracy of the referrals for RA, and were the primary care doctors actually improving based on feedback that they had received by using the app. And then we also had a clinical registry, which is the Ethnic Minority Rheumatoid Arthritis Consortium Registry. That was started by the chair of our division, Dr. Gail Carr, and it was hosted at Harvard University and had like 9 member sites. And the main goal here was to be more illustrative about the differences in RA disease activity and outcomes in ethnic minority patients. And then my baby is a treat to target the Treat to Target and RA study, which basically looks at the role of education in improving patient compliance, understanding, and self-efficacy. Now, all of our studies are meant to be a low burden to the patient in that they are done as a continuum of clinical practice. So it doesn't require any additional visits. Patients are coming to see us, and then they would either, have they'll do some questionnaires for MRAC, or they'll go to the educational session for Treat to Target, or they'll be referred in for the HURAD study. So, a lot of our patients, they have time constraints, and everything was really meant to make it easy for our patients to participate. And another portion of what we do as well is that we have a lot of medical students, residents, and our research coordinators. Most of them are pre-medicine. So all of them have an interest in research and health disparities. And this provides an opportunity to get these young people involved from early and, really working on the pipeline later on for researchers with respect to health disparity. Next. So when the pandemic hit us, I think, not just for us, but for everyone, it's almost as if the world, went on pause. And so too did all research. So everything just stopped for a while. And of course, it affected us significantly because it's a clinical environment and patients were no longer coming into clinic. But as we began to think about solutions for how to see our patients, which was telemedicine, we began to think about, oh, this could work for research as well, because all of our studies were on that clinical continuum. The questions we had were how are we going to recruit our patients? Like, how are we going to do the consent? Because for all of these, we had within our protocols plans for written consent. And how do we do our questionnaires and the education sessions afterwards? And then how do we do the physical examination? And later on, how do we follow these patients over time? But as we thought about telemedicine, we began to see a light because we could just shift to tele-research because all of our procedures, well, except for the physical exam, could be done virtually. But we then encountered a huge problem. Next. And that was that a lot of our patients actually did not have access to Wi-Fi or to smartphones. So, as the world, moved on and spun around and, you're thinking about ways to move on, we had this sort of conundrum in that the same patients who, are majorly affected by the pandemic in all these different areas there was also this disparity when it came to research because they did not have access to Wi-Fi or to smartphones. And if they did, some of them had actually pretty low digital literacy, and it was really hard to do the visits and the clinical consultations over the phone. And so that was actually one of our major challenges that what we thought would be a solution was not really when it came to the research. Now, on the other side, we did find a couple of things that occurred, which was a little bit of a surprise to us. You can go on to the next. And what that was that we realized that a lot of our patients in the clinics, we began to see like less no-show rates in that we could reach our patients by phone, not smartphones or not on Wi-Fi or not a video visit, but we could reach them by phone to have discussions about their clinical care. Next. So while our original research sort of stayed the same and sort of stopped for a while, we began to, as Federico described, we too began to sort of pivot to think about new things or new questions were raised. Some of these questions were related to this whole idea that, hey, we could reach our patients by phone calls and we had less no-show rates by doing that. Is there a way that we could transition this into providing better patient care? Next. So new ideas grew from that, and actually a whole bunch of different collaborations started. We asked ourselves these questions, are phone visits as good as video visits? Do we need to do video visits? And we're now looking into, outcomes in our patients, and comparing the patients who were coded for phone visits versus those who were coded for video visits. Can phone visits be a way to decrease the no-show rates in our clinic and therefore improve access for our patients? A lot of our patients, because of their jobs or because of distance or because of transportation issues, they often sometimes will miss the in-person visit. Well, can we create a protocol where if a patient misses an in-person visit, we can actually call them and follow through on certain things? And will their outcomes be better by doing that? So we've actually submitted and been approved for a grant looking at the role of telemedicine in improving access to care for some of these patients who may not have the Wi-Fi or the smartphone access, but have access to phones, and seeing whether that in itself could lead to better clinical care and better follow-up and better continuity of care. And then, we were approached by some of our partners within Howard and outside of Howard to look at other things. So a lot of collaborations began to occur. One of them, and maybe it's because we now had a little bit more time to think about issues and to think about solutions for them. So for instance, dermatology and rheumatology, we both see a lot of patients who have inflammatory conditions, and there is significant overlap. And we began to think about things that we could do together to look at this, to see whether our patients had the same risk in terms of social determinants of health and within their environment. And we're looking at doing some geocoding for these inflammatory conditions in DC because there's really not a lot of information on that locally. So we've submitted, similar to Federico, we've sort of pivoted. We've submitted for new protocols. We, have new collaborations and the beginning of new research ideas, which, I'm really excited about. And of course, as time has gone on and patients are slowly coming back into clinic, we've also been able to restart and sort of chug along on some of our older projects to make sure that we can get those to completion as well. And we use the opportunity to contact our patients to discuss vaccinations and to encourage them as well, because a lot of our patients have increased risk for that. Next. So in terms of the lessons learned, I think, one of the things that sort of surprised me the most was how quickly things can get done if there's a critical momentum. So, sometimes I feel as if when it comes to bureaucracy, you're sort of, beating your head against the wall and nothing is happening. But maybe if we have better collaboration and if we can work together to have a critical momentum, we can all influence change and things can actually change. I think this really showed us that we can pivot, we can turn the tide, we can do things differently, and we don't always have to be doing things as the ways that they were always done. For us, we hadn't really considered the option of virtual consent in general, but I really think that for low risk studies, that virtual consent is an option. And using tools like e-videos to help guide patients through consent processes, I think, would be very useful for the future. And this is something that we will not turn away from, but this has become an open option for us that we plan to pursue for our future studies. I mean, not everything can be done virtually though, and we know that. So the physical exam in rheumatology is extremely important. How can you see or how can you feel for swollen or tender joints if you're not there to do it? But on the other hand, a lot of us have been very innovative in the way we've done things, and we actually have a protocol for a patient's sort of self-examination as well. And it'll be interesting to see over time whether that's just as good as a physician-done examination, and whether we have similar outcomes in those two groups of patients. And, we know now that disparities in telehealth and teleresearch exist. And this is a sad thought. I would say that over the year, through talking to patients and encouraging, a lot of our patients actually have been able to transition to getting smartphones and getting more access, because for them, this also meant that they, besides not being able to access us for research visits, they really couldn't access their own physicians, etc. So it really created a barrier for them as well. And so we were able to encourage patients who could afford it and who, to look into options for getting, better access. And lastly, the importance of collaboration and a diverse team. I think just meeting and speaking to other researchers, we all had different answers for some of the same questions, and that strengthened the group in general and led to, better proposals for other projects. And, I think in the end, we all worked really well together and we're really able to build from this. And there is always a question that needs an answer. I think that's something that I really learned. When we're doing research, sometimes we may just have to look away from what we are doing. I know that, it's not easy when there are delays in a project that, we're very invested in, but there's always another question that we need to answer. And I think we just have to have that flexibility to be able to pivot to do so. And I just wanted to thank the rest of the Howard research team, which is the chair, Dr. Carr, Dr. Quinones, and Dr. Jamshidi. And then, as I said, we work a lot with our research coordinators. A lot of them are going into medicine afterwards, and they really benefit from the research that we do as well. So just wanted to acknowledge them. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the group for inviting me to speak about our challenges and lessons that we learned during the pandemic. Next slide. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about the challenges that I had with our clinical research during the pandemic. At the time that the pandemic started, we were in the middle of doing a bench to bedside phase 1 clinical trial, and it was being done in the CTSA at the Georgetown Howard University facility. This phase 1 trial was to treat subjects with non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or NASH. And this study started with enrollment in January of 2020. So we had subjects already enrolled when everything shut down for COVID. The patients that were eligible for our clinical trial are the exact patients who were vulnerable to get COVID, in that they were obese with metabolic syndrome. Many had diabetes. And so they were a very high-risk population, and it was going to be challenging to meet enrollment and have those subjects come in to the hospital setting in order to participate in a trial. So when we had the IRB protocol approved for 2 sites at Georgetown University and at the VA hospital, but the VA research closed down completely during COVID. So that was one of our challenges. We had to get approval to recruit some of the patients from the VA to come over to the Georgetown site. And so we had to get the patients to come into the hospital for screening and consenting, and we realized that this was going to be difficult. If I could have the next slide, please. So the solutions that we had for our challenges with the clinical research is that I submitted an IRB protocol modification so that we could consent subjects by telephone. They didn't have to risk coming in for a face-to-face consenting, and that was approved. We also tried to reach out to visiting nurses and other organizations to go to patients' homes to draw their bloods, and they would not do that. No one was going to patients' homes during COVID. However, we did establish an account with LabCorp in order to draw the routine lab tests that we needed. And also LabCorp would do biometrics to obtain the patient's vital signs and weight. So this way, our patients did not have to come into the hospital. They could go to a LabCorp close to their home. And so that decreased the risk because LabCorp would make them schedule an appointment, and they limited the visits. The other approval that we obtained was that we got approval to FedEx the investigational medication to the subject's home so that they didn't have to physically be there to pick up their study medication. We did obtain approval from the IRB at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center to recruit subjects from the VA, but to treat them at the CRU at Georgetown. And then I think the most important thing is how are you going to pay for all these additional costs, including, the LabCorp account. What I did was there was an administrative supplement for our NIH grant, and I submitted that as soon as everything shut down at the end of March. And fortunately, our supplement was funded so that we had the extra funds to make these changes. Next slide. So also, I have a basic research lab that does molecular biology and animal research. And this has also been affected significantly during the COVID pandemic. and it has affected graduate students and their thesis projects. It has affected animal welfare. So I just wanted to briefly mention some of the difficulties we had with doing our bench research. A lot of our projects were delayed because the core facilities were closed at Georgetown University, and we had to have some of our tissue samples from our animals sent out to outside organizations for processing while our facility for histology was closed. We also had to develop and submit a plan for the times and the number of staff that were allowed to be in the lab at one time. At Georgetown University, all of those who were on campus were required to get weekly COVID tests, and we were required to do a daily COVID building access in order to get into the lab. And there was difficulty teaching the graduate students laboratory skills when the laboratory was closed and there was social distancing. So these were some of the challenges that we had with continuing the basic science research. Next slide. So some of the solutions that we had for the bench research is that since we didn't have as much time in the lab doing hands-on research, we did spend some of the time writing new grants and getting caught up on writing our manuscripts. Some of our animal projects, we had to revise their treatment and dosing schedules so that we would have less time in the facility because there was also only 2 subjects allowed in the room at a time for the animal rooms. Our lab meetings were all changed to virtual Zoom weekly meetings rather than in person. And some animal colonies were not maintained. I am aware that other investigators had to actually euthanize a lot of animals because of COVID, and they were not able to maintain the colonies. Next slide. So what lessons did I learn from this? Well, the pros that came out of this experience was that the patients actually liked the telephone consenting for research studies. Also, the patients enjoy the flexibility and the safety of having their blood work done at a small lab closer to their home rather than risk coming into the hospital. I will say that some of the cons from modifying our schedules during the pandemic affected the teaching for the students, the residents, the face-to-face learning, and the hands-on research that just cannot be replaced by the virtual learning experience. And I think that's it. Next slide. Questions? Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Smith. And so if everyone will turn on their videos so we can do a little Q&A. And so where's Federico? Can you turn on your camera, please? So I want to apologize because we are over, but I want to prepare the attendees that the session, we're just going to ask one question because this is such a fascinating panel. And each one of you brought really unique and creative solutions and had unique and creative challenges, right? So one of the questions that that's really been kind of on a lot of our minds is, you know, the strategies and the solutions that you used to overcome the challenges. Do you think that we're going to now incorporate that into our research projects?
I think that a lot of those will be incorporated. I think doing the consent forms by telephone is also, I know Sharon mentioned, and also, as I know Federico mentioned, you know, allowing for changes in the protocol to get different blood tests done at a different location. Some of those things we just have to modify, and I hope that they stick.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And, you know, we cannot predict what will happen again in the future because who would have thought this would happen? But I think having some flexibility in the protocol built into the protocol is absolutely essential. And then you wouldn't have to go on this long pause to get the modifications and to go through that, you know, that process because it would already be built in.
Yeah, I completely agree. What I would say is more and more, so I think we learn a lot of things that we want to do, and a lot of things that we do not want to do. And one thing that to me stays core to all this is research is about collaborations. We cannot do research on our own. And there's some type of collaborations that need the face-to-face continuous interaction, and some collaborations that don't. So Zoom and Teams and all these web-based connections are actually fantastic for some kind of interactions, but they are shortcoming for others. So I think on each of our teams, we are learning what can we do with Zoom, what we cannot, and what things we can do, but we still can do much better by having in-person meetings. That's really my big picture take home from this experience.
Excellent, excellent, thank you. And just one question to wrap it up. How did your teams handle the increased security needs of a dispersed team instead of an institutionally hosted environment? Anyone can touch on that?
Well, I'll just touch on it for us because we did a lot of questionnaires over the phone, etc., and then we had to download those and get them into the patient files. So we had one research coordinator who was coming into the office. Anything that was done on the phone was not identified. It was like a blank, that information was blank. It'll be emailed to her, and she would get a phone call letting her know, who's, which patient it was for, so she can fill in the information and then download it. I'm sure there may be other sophisticated methods of doing that, but that was what we had at our disposal.
And any patient data was always transmitted just with numbers. There was no patient identifying data. And all of our research is done on a cloud through Georgetown. So you could access it remotely with a dual login. So we were able to utilize that for security purposes. We did learn that Zoom is not allowed for consenting, though. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Federico, do you have insight into that? Because I know you're talking about your collaborations and being more global collaborations, right? So can you touch on any of the security aspects that you had to consider?
Well, from our perspective, all we did, although we were at home, everything that was done through the computers in the building. So we were just remoting in. So all the security that we were using when we were in person, the same security was happening and was in place when remoting in. And no one could work from their own computer other than as a display of what was happening here in the lab. So no one could work without their lab computers. As a matter of fact, for example, there were days that computers would be turned off because of power outages or so. Someone would have to come in the lab and physically turn them on for everyone to be able to remote it. And being that I was in the lab every day anyways, I was usually that person.
Lucky for you. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up, but I encourage the three of you, there's questions, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A function. So if you could please type respond to the attendees, that would be greatly appreciated. I want to thank you all again for your time and participating in this conference. Learned a lot, and it was great to get some insight into some of the personal experiences that our researchers were impacted by the pandemic. So thank you, really appreciate it. And so now I will turn